Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we continue to follow one of our subscribers as they go through the current team league at Lichess 4545. This is their round 2 game, very interesting. Let's get into it. Alright, so our hero is in the white, Kai Mate, and they are facing the villain of this story, Race Krista. Anyway, jokes aside, they open up with knight f3, which is very nice, very flexible. You can continue with something like g3, you can transpose into c4 and d4 opening still. There's a lot of options here, but you obviously do give black a chance to take the center if they want to. However, black decided in this game to go b6, and now black is probably anticipating that white is going to fianchetto on the long diagonal, and they're deciding to do the same. So white does to continue with g3, here bishop b7, and now bishop g2. So here we can see that black has now decided to just completely shut down this light square bishop's activity by getting onto the same diagonal. Instead of something like c6 and d5, for instance, with these pawns you can also blunt the bishop. This is a version I quite like to play, but we're about to transpose into a very interesting opening, so let's continue from here. So black continues with e6. At first I was a little bit confused when I saw this. I expected them to play something a little bit more strong in the center, maybe d5 or something. But again, we will see where they are going with this queenside fianchetto in a few seconds. White continues here with d4, so now white is transposing into a d4 opening, taking that claim in the center, and black continues with knight f6. And we are still following just a general Zukertort and knight f3 game, but after we get c4 on the board, and then we are getting closer and closer, bishop e7, and now we know what's going on. Black is in fact transposing back into a Queen's Indian defense. The Queen's Indian defense is basically just getting these two bishops out in this pattern. You'll see that the black bishop on this side is not quite as active, so you'll have to make sure that you can use it effectively, but your light square bishop is obviously very active in this case, and this is really where the Queen's Indian defense comes from, with the queenside fianchetto. I myself like to play something similar to this in the Nimzo Indian defense. It's not quite the same because you trade off the dark square bishop, but there are a lot of similarities, and you can sometimes transpose into this if white, for instance, try to stop you with a3 or something like that. So Queen's Indian defense, there's some theory here. It's not the easiest opening to master because it starts off a little bit passive sometimes, but very interesting, and I quite like the fact that black is playing it in this game. And so far they're doing perfectly fine. There's absolutely no problem in what they're doing. So let's continue. White decides to castle here, and black also castles, and now we get knight c3 on the board. And honestly, this could be any of my games as well, because you've basically played the Catalan setup here. We've got c4 and d4 and g3. You've got a fianchettoed light square bishop, and your knights out on their natural squares. So you see how even though white started with knight f3, they did transpose into a very standard opening, but maybe they've put black in a little bit of an uncomfortable situation, having to decide what to do. If I do look at the times here, though, I can see that white has a little bit more than they started with, and so does black. So probably up to this point, actually, both players were quite comfortable. So in this situation, there's a few ways you can go. Master games continue with something like knight e4. This is very Nimzo-esque. You're just getting something onto the e4 square here, and you're trying to defend it with your bishop, and you're probably going to play something like f5 defending it and try and get a kingside attack going. And this is really kind of like the standard Nimzo idea as well, where you try and trade off this bishop here, this knight on c3 to get more e4 control. The other thing you can do is you can play d5 as well. Again, black just trying to get their own claim to the center a little bit in here, trying to avoid e4 coming from white, because if white gets all of these pawns up here, obviously they've got a lot of control and they can put black under quite a bit of pressure. A last move that I think sometimes gets played is knight a6. I'm not going to get into the details too much, but I think this could be quite fun. Although in this case, I don't think there's any immediate plan for black to do something like this, because they did not continue with something like this. They continued with d6. This is not the most well-known move. This is not the engine's favorite move. This is a little bit passive. Again, if I kind of draw from the Nimzo Indian perspective, I know that you might, for instance, want to match up. If, for instance, white gets a queen on c2 and they can play e4 without dropping it, you might want to match e4 with something like e5 from the black side. This is not going to happen in this exact position, but actually that idea does come forward, and you'll see how a lot of these openings have quite a few similarities. So if you do play the Nimzo Indians yourself, I think you'll also see some of these things coming out here. In this case, though, after d6, white continued with rook e1, so they are very much announcing their intention to put e4 on the board, and this is the clear plan that they're supposed to go for. In this situation now, black decides to play the top move by masters, knight e4, but it was slightly stronger to play it earlier because of the way that the position crumbles out now. So white's got a chance to get a little bit of advantage here, and I don't know if you could find the move in this situation. The move is in fact to play knight g5 right here immediately. Um, there is also something like queen c2 which you can play, which is honestly what I probably would have played in this position. But importantly, once this knight gets to e4, you can see it's only defended once, and it's defended by a piece that is not defended itself. And then all the other pieces and squares that it hits are defended. So if you play something like knight g5, if white found this move, the real danger is the fact that the light square bishop opens up, and the opposite light square bishop, the opposing light square bishop, is not defended. So this knight is currently falling. Let's say we try to protect it with something like f5. Then you continue to take it anyway over here because you get a very, very nice fork. If you continue with something like d5, for instance, on this side again you can take the knight and you're just going to go up a pawn very comfortably. And now you can get e4 in quite likely because black has lost their forward knight, and they've actually lost one of their active pieces. So black have now got to continue their development with the back line, which is still not really ready, and they're a little bit more passive. They have nothing on their own fourth rank even. So definitely not the ideal position for white to be in. Lastly, if you, for instance, say, okay, well, fair enough, I'm going to take your knight, and it hits the queen, this is actually quite easy for white to take care of, because all you have to do is you play queen c2, and the reason this works is because you're threatening mate on h7. This idea of jumping the knight to g4 is also available in the Catalan. I'm not going to try and transpose that position now, but in that actually, maybe I'll just put it on the board in a tiny way. I'm just going to give black some nothing moves here. It's not really important. In this case, maybe the knight needs to go somewhere. Oh, I can't transpose to it properly. Anyway, in a situation like this where this pawn isn't defending here anymore, okay, let's say here, here, here. It's not correct as such. But the point being that after knight g5, you threaten mate and you threaten something else with the light square bishop. And so in the Catalan, there is also a move order like this. And actually, in this position, it was possible for black to find the exact same plan, after white to find the exact same plan. In this position, it doesn't create a winning advantage, but it creates a clear advantage because they will eventually just end up going up in exchange or something similar to that. So just to go through kind of the critical line, they take the knight, white threatens mate. Now they can sack the knight with check, which is probably their best move because they're trying to get rid of it. They're gonna lose it anyway. All right, so in this case, black is actually up a piece and a pawn, but now there's still a threat of mate on the board. So maybe they take the knight, and then white takes this, and now they're going to get a rook for that initial piece and pawn. And this is still just looking pretty good for white overall. They still have more active development over here with their pawns taking up the center. That rook isn't going anywhere, so they don't even have to take it immediately. They can, for instance, take this bishop first, or if black wants to take on c1, they can take back because the rook is completely stuck. Alright, but that is not what happened to the game, so let's continue on. Very naturally, I think, white did not go for this. Potentially they did not see it. They instead simply played d5. And so this is not really the engine's favorite move, but the point is clear, right? They want to cut off the defense of the knight over here. It's hanging now. They want to block in the light square bishop from black's side and try and keep it on that side of the board, not really doing much. And in a sense, they do get to do that because now black took their knight on c3, and they've got kind of like very typical Nimzo Indian double C pawns, but they've already pushed d5, and black actually still has their dark square bishop. So this is fine. This is still a game, but white is no longer completely in head, simply because they've lost the advantage of their space a little bit by pushing this pawn forward. Black can take, black can push past, and white really has no way to make a good advantage come out of this queenside pawn structure. They are probably going to have to play in the center and the king side as well. So here, black continued with bishop x6, very nice, just putting pressure on the pawn, and white defended it. All of these moves are perfectly fine, and now black played the move that I had previously said you want to play against e4. So the move order is slightly different. Black gets e5 in first, and then white plays e4. But this is actually kind of a pawn structure that black could be quite happy with. The reason for this is because the light square bishop is active, and the other light square bishop is getting a little bit passive because it's staring at his own pawns. Also because in these kinds of games, black is often supposed to be doing a kingside attack, and so you're trying to create space for your pieces on this side of the board. By pushing e5, you're locking in e4, you're giving yourself this light square diagonal to play with as well. And of course, if you trade off the light square bishops on this diagonal, that's one less defender for white on the king side as well. So it's not the end of the world. It might actually be advantageous in certain positions. Yeah, so very nice move, I think, for black. No reason to take and undouble the pawns for white. Very nice to lock up this pawn center and try and then work with it. Also, because d5 gives you the c5 square, there is a point where maybe you want to jump your knight in there. This is, again, a structure that you can get in the Nimzo Indian and in the Bogo Indian as well, and in the Queen's Indian defense. Alright, so here comes the black knight now finally trying to finish their development. I would argue that potentially in this position here, e5 directly followed by the knight coming to f6 might have been slightly better. The knight on f6 also puts pressure on this pawn here. It also has a few other squares it can jump to. And instead, in the move order that we got to, the black bishop is taking on f6, which is not really ideal. You do have the c5 outpost, which is really nice right now. Currently, the knight can't really get there. The dark square bishop could take you. That, arguably could be good or bad. I think from black's perspective, you probably don't want to lose the knight on c5, and from white's perspective, they might want to take it. But yeah, these pieces are just a little bit backwards. I think the knight probably belongs on f6. And actually, we will see in a second that black does look at that in their own game as well. From the white perspective now, we've got the center locked up, and clearly we're not going to make any progress on the queen side, so we also have to try and find a way to play on the king side. So both players are in fact now looking at the king side probably to find some way to make some progress here. And white decides to just start off with bishop e3, looking at that c5 square, kind of telling black, put a knight there, I'll take it. Which I think will be pretty okay for white in that case, because they have quite a locked up center, which means that the bishop pair isn't that strong because there's only so many open diagonals to play with. So in this case, actually, black, I think, realized the situation that I just pointed out, and they played g6. So this bishop probably doesn't belong over here, and it looks like they're making space for it to go back, and maybe they have also got a plan for their other knight, or potentially they want to break with f5. As I mentioned, after the knight jumps to e4, f5 is very natural in many of these structures for black. Alright, and now white said, yeah, no, sure, but let me do the same thing. And so white also jumps their knight out of the way, and now it looks like they are also preparing with their own f4 break. So everyone is trying to play on the king side now. Even though white's pawn structure is worse over here, black can make no real extensive progress. There is it's so much time. It is possible for black to, for instance, do this with their knight and put the bishop there and double attack the pawn, but it's going to be double defended for a long time, and it's a massive waste of time, I think. So although it is possible for black to kind of make progress on the queen side with some attacking plan, it really doesn't go anywhere, and it'll give white a lot of time to get the king side rolling. So I'm kind of glad that both players didn't decide to go there, because I don't think it would work out very well for either of them. Definitely we want to focus on the king side here. So after knight d2, white's getting ready for their own break. Black's also getting for their own break, or potentially getting ready for the knight to jump out. Apologies for the knight to jump out. And here comes white, f4. And so in this position, actually, f4 is a slight mistake. If black plays correctly. So they have to take. This is the line that the engine would suggest here. And after you take back with your pawn, in the long run, basically, white is not able to break through here just yet. Black has got enough time, pieces, and mobility to stop this break. And white's king is just a little bit too weak on this semi-open file, and all of these kind of H squares are getting a little bit airy as well. So for instance, queen f6 now also threatening that pawn. You can't go over here because then you drop your f pawn. So for instance, here you would bring out your rook, and then maybe you bring out your other rook. And you can see how slowly black is just kind of coming in to this side of the board. They only need to bring their bishop in now at this point, so it might be that they end up putting their queen out, getting their knight in, and then bringing their bishop out. Yeah, and they've got kind of sufficient control of this e5 square, so it's not easy for white to break. The f5 square isn't really a break right now either. Both their rooks are on the files that you might want to be on, and all their pieces are getting into the game. And in comparison, this knight is kind of not quite, is playing more passive. This rook on c1 is playing passive, so white's in a position where they don't quite have the right set up to take advantage of a potential pawn push, which is why I guess the engine is not such a fan of this for white. However, in the game, black decided not to take the pawn, but to instead just follow through with the plan that they had made already, and they played f5, and now we're back to being somewhat equal. Both players have made space on the f file for a pawn push. I would argue that black is still slightly better because they already have their f knight on the f file. But on the other side, they haven't put their queen anywhere yet, so they still have to bring the other rook in, and also their bishop. Although it has a plan here that you could potentially do with something like c6 as well to undermine things a little bit. Probably actually want to just bring it back and play on the other diagonal, the one that you've made space for. So you can try and get something going on the king side with your light square bishop as well. Alright, so here white took, and then they took with the pawn. That's correct. In both of these cases, if your opponent takes your f-pawn, it's normally correct to take with the g-pawn. I had a Rossolimo game earlier today where it was okay to take with the g-pawn, or I could have taken with the knight, which I jumped over there to take back. But in general, the point of these f5 breaks is to make space and to push your opponent's pieces and pawns backwards. Well, you can't push pawns backwards, apologies, pieces backwards. So you want to take with the pawn, so you have two pawns next to each other, so you continue pushing up. If you take with the piece instead, then you have a half open file and an open file, but you don't quite have anything to continue attack with. So yeah, so GX for me also feels very natural. And here white says, alright, cool, I'm going to get my rook over here. I believe the plan for them was to try and maybe play up the A pawn. Maybe if they can take the knight at some point, you wouldn't be able to take back with the B pawn because your bishop would hang. Also probably because they're just not sure exactly where to put the rook, and they maybe didn't want to move the E rook back to F1. It's difficult to admit if you've made kind of a potential mistake, but I wouldn't really know if this is a mistake in this case because the initial plan with the rook e1 was really clear. But now that the position has transformed, yeah, rook back to f1 and putting other rook on e1 I think makes quite a lot of sense as well, because that's exactly what black is also going to do, I think. Alright, so here comes black's queen finally getting into the game. Not an especially ambitious move, just getting off the back rank. And queen c2. So black is threatening here to push the pawn to push the pawn to e4, which would hit the queen, so white correctly just kind of gets out of the way early. Now there's no tempo here, and they've got time to play. It is possible to take here, obviously, but I think black would just end up having very strong, what do you call it, compensation, either with the two pawns or even with the knight in that case. So if you took here and they took with the knight, that knight suddenly looks at a lot of squares in the white side camp. Whereas the opposing knight kind of doesn't really look at much at all. So definitely I would say that taking is not a good move for white, and I think it's good that they decided to rather just leave the pawn there, leave the tension there, and get their queen out of the way. In this case now, white does kind of get to feel satisfied as well because black does play e4. They're taking the space. Yeah, the trick here is that they're letting go of the tension, right? It's not always bad. They're getting a passed pawn now, which is protected, but its protection might be undermined actually because this is a backwards pawn, right? There's no more pawns that can protect it. Maybe a better move in this case would have been to just get the other rook over to the file, and then I pull on a little thing. So in the game, white played g4, but in this position, if white plays g4, it's actually not so good at all because you can take that pawn, and this pawn is still protected. And this pawn is currently not under threat, so white just loses a pawn, and there's no clear kind of advantage here. Um, yeah, and if you ever take there, you take with the knight, and again, the position is opening up, but black just has a little bit more kind of presence in the situation with their knight in a really good square, with this pawn kind of pushing a little bit more forward. So in the game, letting go of the tension here was maybe not the best move for black, but I can understand the thinking. It also opens up the dark square bishop along the long diagonal, but this bishop is currently not really doing anything. This rook is not really doing anything. It's maybe better for black to just get their last pieces into the attack before committing their pawns forward. But anyway, so they played e4, and here white does play g4. And the difference in the position is now is after you take, which black did, um, this pawn hangs. And now the situation has kind of reversed. Now white's pieces are going to become active. Black doesn't really have the same presence anymore. White's pawn on f4 is actually protected sufficiently at the moment. This g pawn, although it's in the same position, the file isn't open really, and there's no specific value that I can get from this pawn just yet. So actually, I think some of the engine lines tells them to put the queen over on h4 just to keep that pawn safe and maybe get the queen a little bit more active as well. But yeah, so a little bit of a misstep by black, not realizing that pushing the pawn is maybe just a tiny bit premature. So interesting move, but a little bit tough. And here, good move by white, finding out that they can break up the structure from black side, get that e4 square under control, get that pawn, and it's a really, really good trade for white. Now they are the ones with the active knight. They also have some open lines for their queen later on. Again, the light square bishop for black is not really in the game just yet. The way that they did play ended up kind of playing into white's d5 hands. So this d5 move was not the best, but it blocks out the light square bishop, and that is actually still what is happening. So it turns out to be a good move the way that the game has gone. So they took the pawn, very nice. Black now wants to bring their own knight in. They want to oppose. They want to trade off. However, there was a little bit of a thing they had to be careful of here. This knight currently looks at both of these squares. Also here, but I think it's slightly less important. And you know that white has the e6 square available to themselves because they have that d5 pawn. And when you play knight f6, unfortunately you cut off protection of the g5 square because now nothing's looking at it, and white gets a really, really nice chance just to sink their knight into that e6 square. That is a dream square for the knight. So in this case now you have to try and counter that square over there, because it's going to be very, very difficult to work with a knight sitting on e6 with the other pieces following up behind it. So correctly, I would originally think, correctly the black player played bishop c8. This is the plan that I was suggesting now for a few moves. Get the light square bishop onto the active diagonal where you've made space for it. In this case now, importantly, you're trying to cover the e6 square. But now this actually just fails tactically. Very, very unfortunate. So actually what you should have done is you should have brought over your rook first. And for instance here, if they play something like this, I think you can actually just lift your other rook up and you're doing okay. Everything is still kind of defended. There's no immediate problems. If they trade off, this is actually not the end of the world. You've got a lot of pressure here. You can trade off a queen for two rooks, potentially, if you want to. If not, you can step the queen out of the way when this bishop moves. You've also now protected your b-pawn, your g-pawn. So this position, a little bit here, you can see still good for white, the engine says, but maybe a little bit better than what happened in the game. So I'm going to put this on the board now, and maybe just give it a second. If you're already looking, see if you can figure out, I gave one of the moves away now. What is the threat that white has? Because I pointed it out earlier in the game actually, right? Knight g5 lines up very well with queen c2 on the h pawn. The only problem is that currently that dark squared knight, that dark knight is protecting it. And so the move here for white, really, really nice, it's bishop d4. And it's twofold. You're attacking the knight that you want to get rid of, and you're opening up your rook on the open file and hitting the queen, so it comes with tempo. So black has no choice but to respond, and now after they play maybe their queen back, still protecting that knight, still keeping on contact, you take, and no matter which way they take back, your queen is going to take on h next. So they took with the rook, for instance. Here comes the white queen, takes the check, and suddenly black's position is starting to crumble. The king is open, there's only one move. White's got possession of the open file. The black rook is still on a8. The light square bishop is on c8, which you thought would be quite useful, but unfortunately now it's not covering sufficiently anymore because the other pieces for white are so active. So the game continued with king f8, which is forced, there's nothing around it. And here, a very, very nice fork, and a very, very nice idea as well. So I'm obviously going to lose this knight now to the bishop probably, so take the bishop, take the pawn, but now you have a second threat because you're pushing the pawn with a royal fork, which is not something you see often. Normally pawns don't get to fork a king and queen at the same time. So here, black decided to try and get this queen out of the way, but actually, so the best move here is not what white played, but I think that the decision was very practical. White actually just took the rook and said, I don't mind, now you're down a rook and I still have my royal four coming. The best move that the engine would give you is something like queen f5. Personally, I think I probably would have calculated a little bit first. The reason I don't like this is if they, bring over their rook, then I'm a little bit scared again. But actually, it doesn't matter. You're still perfectly fine in this situation. So rook f6 here, and you can just take on the g4 square, and you're still protecting this pawn, which is still threatening that. And you still have a lot of activity also with your queen, so you're doing very, very well. But in the game, white just said, you know what, let me simplify. Hold my beer and my queen, actually, if you don't mind. Black obviously took the queen back, and here comes the royal fork. So queen takes, rook takes, and king takes. And now also the unleashed bishop. So remember, knight g5 has two threats. You threaten with the queen, you threaten the h-pawn, and the second threat is that you unleash your light square bishop. And now finally white cashes in on that light square bishop, and they take the rook in the corner, and they're just up a rook. The pawn structure in this situation doesn't matter because black has no immediate breaks. The doubled pawns here at least still try and stop these other pawns a little bit. The isolated pawn in the g file unfortunately cannot go anywhere by itself. So white is now just up a rook and clearly winning, but still has to convert. So in this situation, the game continued a little bit further. I'm going to go slightly faster, but there's one or two moves here that I also quite liked. That I'd like to point out. So, took a pawn, king up, very nice, king over. So, black thinks that they need to put their king over here with the other isolated pawn, oppose the other king, and potentially there's some way that they could slip through. Probably not, but you never know. So they're trying to come in and protect the last pawn, and also stay off the open file, correct? So here, I like this move, for instance, bishop c6. What this does is it really just stops 3 of the 4 pawns for black on this side of the board. They can't move either because they are not allowed to move or because if they move, they fall. So very, very nice. This is now also an outpost in the way because the king can't get to that bishop really unless you walk all the way around, but actually you can't because these squares are all covered. So the king can't get to that square and the opposing bishop can't get to that square. So really, really nice. You don't have to rush. You don't have to immediately attack. You can just block off those pieces. And here after the king came down, finally the rook came into the game as well. There's a lot of open space that you can get into the back of your opponent's space here, so anything could work. In this position, after bishop e5, it is actually winning to take the bishop and take back, but the way you win now is through tempi. So you're going to play a Zugzwang game basically. You have a bishop which can keep on moving, and black's king is the only piece that can always keep on moving. So if this pawn moves, it gets taken. This pawn can move, but you can block it afterwards. If this pawn moves, it gets taken. This pawn can't move. And this pawn, after you play something like king up, can't move either. So the king basically has to move now or in a few moves. and then eventually you can either take this pawn, which is on a light square, or if the king walks away from it, you can take it with your king, and then slowly but surely black will be losing. But this is not quite the way the game went, so I wanted to point it out. In this case, actually, they just played rook e4, they're protecting there, they're attacking there, took a pawn, the backwards pawn, doesn't really matter, the other one is still sufficiently protecting these squares as well. And here comes the light square bishop, and now this isolated pawn is going to fall. And it's going to fall with kind of like a little bit of an additional benefit for white in this case as well. So after a5, the pawn falls, and now they bring in their light square their rook all the way to the back rank. So the extra benefit that I was talking about is that black actually put their king on the h file, so the king is also completely cut off. And not that it specifically matters, but it looks a little bit clean just to have the king cut off before you do anything else. And after bishop back, this backwards pawn can't really be defended. If you want to push it twice, then these two pawns are both going to be weak as well. So unfortunately, the position is just getting a little bit difficult for black to keep together. And here, actually, already, again, white can take the dark square bishop and be winning. But instead, they first blocked off and moved their pieces around. And you'll see also this that the light square bishop is protecting this backwards pawn. So king up, and here white finally took, and already the engine announced its mate. I think it's like mate in 20 or something, but it's basically because the pawns still have to get up to the board, but the king can get in, and this is really where the game is over. There isn't really much to it anymore. The king still shuffled around a little bit, but after one pawn was left and everything else was off the board, black threw in the towel, and white won a very convincing game out of a very messy middle game, I would say. I want to quickly go back to that middle game. Really, the thing I learned from this for me is, because I played the black side of this a lot, right? Is to make sure which pieces you put on the right squares here. I like the idea for black to fianchetto, but it's maybe a little bit slow. And also, after you try to break, make sure if the break is worth it. So in this case, taking is slightly better, but it feels a bit unnatural. But after you play up, you will realize that slowly but surely you just don't really have the right pieces in the game just yet. So your queen can't come onto the diagonal very easily. Maybe only here, which isn't really that good. So probably want to move it over to the light squares, and you still have to get these pieces into the game. So although I like the break idea, we're a little bit slow with getting all our pieces in, and white kind of has the control of that side of the board, at least up to here, right? So black can push past, but unfortunately that relinquishes their control. Even though they get more space, they let go of the position in the wrong way. And very, very good by white just to undermine that and then kind of turn the tables on them with that knight coming in. A very, very unfortunate one for this for black. Although even if they find out, so even if they protected the square like that, it is still, I think, plus 1.5 or something for white. They have a fairly good position here. They could actually still jump the knight if they wanted to, because it's double protected. But there are probably a few other moves that they could also have considered in this case. Maybe even just bringing out more of their rooks before eventually deciding to jump the knight or push the pawn or anything similar like that. Alright, and that's it. So congratulations to Kai Mate, our hero in this game again. Very, very convincing win at the end there in the middle game after they found a very, very nice continuation. I'm going to point out my little pattern here one more time. Let's say in this position, knight g5, you take, and here. So if you fianchetto and you have your queen on c2, always look at knight g5 because it might give you two threats and a winning advantage. You're looking at that h-pawn, you're also looking with your light square bishop. So in a case like this, for instance, they can play something like h6, but it would still be mate. They can take your bishop, but it's still mate. They can take your knight, but then the bishop hangs, and this knight over here is also hanging as well. So it's a really, really nice pattern to know. And if you're playing any of these c4, d4, light side fianchetto structures on the white side, it is something that you're going to run into now and then. So know your patterns. Alright, so that's it. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. If you've got a game you want to have covered in the channel, please let me know. This is not something we do ongoing, but this is a special case where someone reached out and was willing to help us along a little bit, so we're super, super keen. But also always interested in having new conversations. We're trying to grow and trying to do some new things, so please reach out if you've got ideas. Sure, thank you again, and see you in the next one. Bye bye.